Hello, everyone. You are listening to the Animalia Hour on KGVM. We are a podcast based in Bozeman, Montana, committed to environmentalism, human health, and redefining our relationship to other animals. We hope through this podcast to inspire you to live vegan for the same reasons. I'm Kevin.
I'm Lucy.
And I'm Sarah.
Hey,
everybody.
how's it going?
Welcome back.
We're returning to continue our discussion of Hope Bohanec's anthology, which she edited. It's an 18-chapter book that just came out this year, 2023. The title of that anthology is The Humane Hoax, Essays Exposing the Myth of Happy Meat, Humane Dairy, and Ethical Eggs. And yeah, I feel like it's like this one-of-a-kind book out there. It's such an important and a timely book.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about it is that she's been a vegan now for like 31 years. And so she's able to see the trends and how she said, I think I was watching a kind of a lecture she was giving in Honolulu at their vegan society in 2018. And at that point, she said like 10 years ago, so it would have been like maybe 2008, 2000, in that area of time, you started to see these humane labels come about. And it was a way for people to feel okay about eating meat.
It was a really intelligent move on the part of animal agribusiness to start labeling animal flesh and animal secretions with these really beautiful sounding and animal welfare sounding labels that, we're taking them out of the cages, we're letting them, free range on pastures, we're letting them,
Right.
We're raising them organically now and
Right.
And making you think that they care, now that they
exactly.
care.
Or almost that they're doing something wonderful for the animals.
it definitely gives the consumer the impression that the industry overall is improving and becoming more humane and more eco-friendly, more environmentally friendly, when, as this book really does a great job of exposing, like all of that is completely false. In fact, the opposite is true, that
Right.
the situation is only getting worse for animals as the demand for their flesh and their secretions just continues to grow globally. And these labels are unregulated largely. They really don't have a clear definition, or they're not held to account.
Right.
So they're basically meaningless labels.
Right. Well, she mentioned in this lecture too that farmers, for the most part, can just apply for a humane label, and it's just paperwork. It gets approved. Very rarely does anyone come out and actually check their facility. The only exception would be if they say they're antibiotic free, then some of their meat will be tested. But otherwise,
Or organic, maybe.
organic.
Yeah.
But I don't know. But she made it sound like free range. A lot of things. It's
Well,
just,
organic and antibiotic free are basically the same thing.
Are they?
So yeah, you have to prove that you're not giving your animals any medicine,
I see.
basically.
But yeah, it sounds like the rest of them, free range and cage free, and all these labels that farmers can use, they just basically scratch it off, tick it off on an application.
You probably pay a
fee, yep,
Yeah.
and they get it.
And then, of course, the consumer is happily spending more of their grocery shopping dollars on these products because they think, oh, I do care about animals and I don't want them to suffer more than they have to. So you're giving more money to the industry and really not helping the animals or the planet at all.
Right.
I heard a debate this past week, and it was a debate between a vegan, or I think actually a near vegan, and a carnist, or just, is that an appropriate word? Are we gonna?
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Carnist.
Omnivore. We'll say
omnivore.
more. Should we say that?
Bears are omnivores. I think cats are dogs are omnivores. But
So it was
I don't know if humans are
a
omnivores.
debate between a standard American eater and somebody who is vegetarian and becoming vegan. And I was so frustrated as I was listening to this debate because there was so much misinformation flying back and forth. And, I felt like, oh my goodness, like the standard American eater was saying all kinds of things that, we, from all the research we've been doing, even just for this podcast, I knew was misinformation. And the person representing the vegan side didn't know enough to know that what they were saying was untrue, and so didn't call them out. And so it was just perpetuating a lot of misinformation. And one of the biggest things that just continually came up were things that are addressed from this book, The Humane Hoax. So basically they were both agreeing, both sides of the argument were agreeing that, yes, factory farms are terrible. They're horrible, terrible. We need to get away from supporting factory farms. We need to get back to buying our food locally from a family-owned local farm where animals are treated wonderfully. And let's get back to traditional ways of raising animals. And that was just one of many things that kept coming up. And they both feel like they could agree on.
Right.
And that's the danger that is so well pointed out in this book, is that this idea that, oh yes, factory farms are terrible. That's something that everybody seems to be getting on board with. Everybody says factory farms are terrible. You hear that no matter where you go. And so this idea that somehow we could just get away from factory farms is, if you stop and think about that, it's so ridiculous and unreasonable. Factory farms have created this supply. So the demand for animal flesh and animal secretions has grown because it's available. In order to supply the demand, you have to have these efficient forms of animal agribusiness to produce the amount,
numbers.
the quantity.
Right.
And so
it needs to be efficient, right?
To think that we could fill the demand with small local farms, somehow go back into history where everybody got their meat from small local farms is ridiculous. Here's a quote from chapter 7 of this book. It says, phasing out CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, otherwise known as factory farms. So phasing out factory farms, I'll just say, as estimated by postdoctoral fellow Jan Dukowitz and his colleagues, would necessitate reducing U.S. meat production and consumption by over 90%. So what that's saying is, if we got rid of factory farms and everybody had to just buy from traditionally raised animals on the local farm, we would have to reduce our meat intake, our consumption of meat, by 90%.
Right.
Does that include dairy, eggs, other things, honey, other things like this? Or
Let me see. Yeah, it says animal food. So I think that it's not just one of those sectors. It's all of agri.
And this is what we keep hearing, right? Because of the American diet, the demand for meat, we would need basically 5.5 Earths, something like that, to maintain the American diet. If the entire world were to eat like the American diet, we'd need 5.5 Earths to do it. And that's not because of plant growth. That's because of animals. And as we know, animals eat about 75%, I believe, of the crops that are grown.
Yeah.
So, whereas if we all went to a plant-based diet, 1 Earth would do the trick. Anyway.
Yeah.
And also there's these studies that show that if you would cut animal agriculture out and we would just all go plant-based overnight, we could rewild 75% of the land, because we wouldn't need that land for crops to feed to animals and for the animals to graze on as well, and anything like that, like the land that these factory farms are on, etc.
Right, and that would help with climate change, because we keep hearing about regenerative farming and how it's sequestering carbon. And so if you rewild the rest of the planet that we don't need, then it might really deal with the climate change issue that we're all facing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And can I just want to interject. It goes along with what you guys are saying right now. It just seems so popular right now that people come at vegans with this argument that that plants either have sentience, and so you're still causing suffering by eating plants, number one, or they'll say, oh, all of your plant agriculture is killing millions of insects and small rodents, as you harvest your, or as you plant, or for plant agriculture. Both of those arguments, can we just stop and remember that 70, depending on your source, between 60 to 70 to 75 to 80% of the crops grown, the plant crops grown, are fed to livestock.
Yes.
Right.
So if you stop having to feed these animals, we would be having to plant and harvest far less plants.
Right.
So you're minimizing suffering in so many ways when you stop eating animals.
Right.
And of course, like the point about the sentience of plants, right? Of course, they don't have a nervous system. So like at least they're not suffering, if you could call it that, as much as animals, because they don't have a nervous system.
Right.
If they had a version of that, let's say, that would be a different version of pain, even if you want to go there. Even so, you're still reducing the amount of plants you kill, right? We still need to sustain ourselves.
Right.
But we can reduce so much suffering, and also we don't have to exploit mammals or like fish or like these animals.
It's funny, yeah.
That clearly, consistently demonstrate the ability to feel pain, the ability to suffer, so.
Right. No, it's funny, but you're right. They keep using it as an argument maybe against veganism, but it's actually an argument for veganism. It's just so funny.
That's it.
And it's what you mentioned. We were just talking a little earlier before the podcast started about this different fallacies. And I think Lucy had mentioned something called the Nirvana Fallacy, which is basically, and we keep running into it, where if you can't reach perfection, then why bother? Why try? Let's see. It's okay. So she just handed me the Nirvana Fallacy. It's comparing a realistic situation with an idealized one, and discounting or even dismissing the realist solution as a result of comparing to a perfect world or impossible standard, ignoring the fact that improvements are often good enough reason. All right.
Mm-hmm. That's basically what Nirvana Fallacy stands for.
It's this idea that like, no matter what we do, it's not perfect. There's going to be some suffering involved. You're going to kill rodents when you're harvesting your crops or whatever. So therefore, why even try? Just eat whatever the heck you want.
Right.
It's like this. It's like throwing up your hands in this helpless state of like, since we can't ever, attain perfection, then we should just kill everything we want to kill.
Right.
That was almost like, I accidentally hit a small animal on the road on my way through town. So I guess I'm guilty. So I guess I should just give up and, go ahead.
And that just shows how disconnected we are from the victims, because that's the only time you can actually use that as an argument, because you're focused on yourself and how you feel about it. Like, I feel guilty then, and I feel a little bit more guilty for exploiting more animals or something. But if you're focused on the victims, you care that it's less victims,
Yeah.
You care that at least, these are accidents that we can't necessarily completely avoid. We can try to reduce crop deaths. And by the way, who's going to try to reduce crop deaths? People who care about not exploiting animals, or people who don't care about it?
Mm-hmm.
I would not mind it. But yeah.
Yes, I totally agree that, yes, can we be intellectually honest, and can we admit that, yes, so much of what we do, either inadvertently or intentionally, does carry an element of violence, but our goal as a human species is to minimize the violence that we commit in this world, and to minimize the suffering of our fellow beings.
Right.
And a good way you can understand, like, if you're being speciesist, meaning like you don't care about animals because they are animals, but a good way to know if you're being trapped in this mindset is to replace these animals with humans or dogs even. And if you replace, like, for example, like so many dogs are farmed, and there's some dogs that are gonna die in car accidents, or even humans, whoever, are you gonna stop driving, for example, or are you gonna like continue driving but choose not to exploit these humans or these dogs because it's avoidable, and it's so, like, you know what I mean? It's different. Accidents versus intentionally exploiting or using someone or killing them. There's a big difference, and you can reduce accidents as well.
Right.
But you know, it's never a net zero, unfortunately.
Right. And I don't know why it always comes up for me when we have discussions like this, but, you know, Steven Pinker wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, subtitle Why Violence Has Declined. And for some reason, you know, it all makes us feel good that, you know, we think the world is getting better. The world is becoming a better place. But it seems like and by the way, in his book, he uses humane killing, humane killing as part of his argument for how things are getting better. And yet what we're going to talk about today is kind of a continuation of this whole humane washing. But when it comes to factory farming, like we're saying, it's actually not getting better. It's getting worse. So
For the animals.
Correct. And for humans, really, if you think about disease.
For the planet, for
yeah,
everyone,
everything. The
really.
planet, yeah, it's actually not getting better.
So last week we discussed the portions of this book that dealt with humane washing, that somehow we can exploit animals, commodify animals, and still do it in a more humane way. We went through how this book exposes that is a myth. This week we wanted to focus a little bit more on the greenwashing of the animal agriculture business, that somehow we can farm animals in ways that are not bad for the planet, or, you know, actually are, you know, some claim that they're actually good for the planet. We're hearing more and more. And that we, you know, so this would include labels like regenerative farming, regenerative grazing, you know, things like that somehow we are balancing out our carbon footprint, and we're feeding the nutrients back into the soil and things like that. So these claims that are being made that this book really exposes as being fiction, that once again, a lot of these labels don't even have clear definitions. Everybody means something different when they say them.
Right.
And they, you know, lots of times they pay for studies to be done that kind of give them the results they want when they research these things. So
That's the way it's been for a long time. And I feel like it's always worth saying, and this is unfortunate, but if you're an environmentalist and you also care about the animals, you really need to stop and think, because a lot of people, when you start telling them about, you know, the brutality of factory farms, everyone's like you were saying earlier, Sarah, that, you know, we're all against factory farms. So that's why I go to free range, or that's why I have cage free, or this is that. But those farms, those free range farms, are actually worse for the environment. They use more resources. They use more water. Mm-hmm. So if you care about the environment, factory farming is better. But factory farming is actually worse for the animals. They're both bad for the animals. So the real solution is to not eat animals altogether.
Or the secretions,
or the secretions, the whole shebang. You know? Yeah, no. When I say that, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not.
Yes,
I'm not.
Absolutely. It's just because people might not, you know.
No, clear. Let's be clear. No, we're vegans, and we're talking about everything, including honey.
Yes.
So I would love if we could unpack this, what is known, I guess, as in school as the 10% law, which is something that I don't remember actually learning super clearly in school. But it's basically that instead of eating plants directly, we funnel them through the extremely complicated machine that is an animal. So as dictated by a natural principle that most of us are taught in school, this book reads, known as the 10% law, an average of only 10% of consumed energy is passed up each trophic level. So tremendous energy losses are incurred when farmed animals convert plants into meat, into dairy, into eggs. So the basic laws of biophysics for animal agriculture's inefficiency would be that agricultural practices are not necessarily at fault here, but our choice of food is. So basically, there is no way to do animal agriculture any differently. It's just a law of science that when you eat at the top of the food chain, you have just wasted so much resources, to get the calories that you can glean from that flesh or from that milk or from that from those eggs. So much energy and so many resources have been wasted along the way.
Right. You know, it reminds me, I went to a physics conference a few years ago, and they were talking about the internal combustion engine. And they basically said like the most efficient internal combustion engine could produce 45% efficiency, the best. And so that's why some people now with all, Teslas and EVs and things like this, we're trying to get away from internal combustion engines. But you just think about that. And most cars didn't operate at a 45% efficiency, but the amount of waste, and if you ever stood next to a car, all the energy and all the heat it was giving off. Do you know what I mean? It's just a bunch of wasted energy and fossil fuels and the whole shebang, right? But think about that in terms of factory farming and what we're talking about right here. Like if you care about your 401k, you would not do your 401k like you would do factory farming. The return on investment would be horrible, okay? If you're an accountant, if you're an MBA, to go do the math on factory farming, you're going to find that it's completely inefficient and we're wasting our money and we're wasting our taxes because it's subsidized out the ass.
So since only a small fraction of caloric energy reaches the top of the food chain, a large material base is needed to support heavy meat eaters within any population size. So there's devastating results from billions of humans adopting animal-centric dietary norms, which unfortunately are globally considered aspirational and associated with wealth and status. So as the globe aspires to be more like the U.S. or basically just to have a higher standard of living, because as we know, eating animals has always been, throughout human history, eating animals has always been a privilege for the wealthy, for the powerful, the people who have resources, expendable resources. Eating plants has always been the world's diet for the rest of humanity, the poor. So right. as the world aspires to have a higher standard of living and eats more meat, we were creating a situation that the planet cannot sustain. The lower one eats on the food chain, the more resources are spared, including vast areas of land to help disrupt the climate and extinction crises, all while significantly decreasing biosecurity risks, including zoonotic diseases.
We need to do a show on zoonotic diseases, really. We really do. Anyway, sorry to interject.
So because of the plentifully produced, animal flesh and animal secretions, we've really lost that awareness as a species. We humans have lost or forgotten that it costs a lot to eat animals. It costs the planet a lot. It costs a lot of resources, a lot of energy, because it used to be very clear, when people had to produce their own food, that eating animals was not a sustainable way to live. Like it was just so much more sustainable to eat plants. But now because animal products are so subsidized by the government, which artificially decreases their cost, so now, someone of limited means can go to a restaurant, a fast food restaurant, or go to, a grocery store and can find really cheap animal products because, again, they're subsidized to be that cheap. And so we've lost that awareness that actually it's a privilege to eat that way. And it's really not sustainable.
Right. Everybody wants to eat like a king, huh?
Yeah, and I mean we've been kind of lied to that there's no end to the bounty, and that restaurants like Arby's or whatever, like you can always count on going and getting copious amounts of meat on your sandwich. Like it's just we've lost the awareness that actually it took so much to produce that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, she talks about that in the book, like the level of efficiency and machinery that's necessary to produce, and everything we're talking about, to produce this meat that I think the average consumer is unaware of, really.
So, and I mean, I think another thing that we've really forgotten as human beings is that domesticating animals is kind of a new phenomenon, and that throughout time, through animal agriculture, herding cultures have always imbalanced ecosystems, and they've often turned fertile lands into deserts. We see grazing animals as natural and going back to our roots somehow, and like this traditional way of living. Like we see farmlands and cows on pasture, and we have this romantic feeling when we see that.
Right.
But over time, humans have continued replacing native biodiverse habitats with pastures and feed crops and farmed animals. And so viewing such landscapes as normal or even natural is due to a phenomenon called shifting baseline syndrome, is what they call it, in which environmental knowledge is lost over time. And it works to distort each generation's perception of how even the most quote unquote sustainable livestock production has heavily modified the natural world. In order to have animal agriculture, like we've had to kill off so much wildlife,
Right.
because either the herbivorous wildlife that is a competitor for the livestock's food, or the carnivorous wildlife that is a predator to your livestock, those all have to be eradicated. And then, we turn the actual flora of the area into more and more monoculture. So like
Right.
the native flora die off, and this has contributed to soil erosion and degradation. And so I think that's another important point I think to lift up, is that this is not natural, and it's not the way it used to be. In fact, this book goes into great detail about how most of America, most of the UK, most of these countries were heavily forested, and we've turned our countries into grazing land and monocrops for livestock. And so we've lost so much of our ecosystems.
Right. It just also reminds me, as we are moving into wildlands, more and more we see headlines, or we hear headlines of wild animals coming into cities, bears around here, or somewhere I just saw a headline of a mountain lion just walking down like a street in a town, terrorizing people. I don't know that the animal did, but one time in Bozeman, I was going down Wilson Avenue, and a white-tailed deer had jumped over a fence and got caught in the fence, and I think spiked itself on the fence, and was, at a point where it was bleeding out. So someone called the police, and the police showed up, and they basically had to club this thing in the head to kill it. And it's just, again, it just reminds you of, we're moving into wild country, and this is the animals' terrain, and we keep pushing them further and further out. And of course they're going to come back into their territory. And the thing is, it's not necessary. And a lot of times this plays into the whole American dream, and where everyone needs to have their little piece of land, and that's fine. But playing into the whole American idea is that we always want more, right? Everybody wants a bigger piece of the pie. And I just feel like that plays into, we take more than we need, we use more than we need. It's this conspicuous consumption that we've all kind of grown up with in the last few decades, and it's detrimental to the environment. It's detrimental to wildlife. It's detrimental to animals in general, and to us.
So the idea that, again, if we were just eating plants, we would have to use much less land to grow our food than we are currently using,
Right.
which would free up so much land that could be rewilded. I think I read in this book that the biomass of the planet used to be 1% human and 99% wildlife, and that's literally flipped, so that now it's 1% wildlife on this planet, and the rest of the 99% is our farmed animals.
Right.
and human beings.
It's crazy. That is crazy.
And most of them are farmed animals.
And most of that is farmed animals. You're right. They outnumber the humans. Yeah.
And fish as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So one thing that comes up a lot in outreach is when people come at us with, the idea of, well, what about regenerative farming? What about regenerative grazing? That's actually good for the land, that somehow the animals grazing on the land is and doing it the right, quote unquote, right way is somehow going to save the planet. One of the things that I think you, Kevin, when your research found out that there basically isn't even a agreed upon definition
Right.
of what regenerative farming even is.
Right. Yeah, and you might be aware of the Netflix documentary, I think it's called Kiss the Ground, where it tries to explain regenerative farming. And it keeps coming up as we keep running into it in discussions with people. Somebody ran an article, a series of articles in the publication called The Counter. I think it may be related to grist. You can look it up. Just type in regenerative farming, The Counter, and I'm trying to find the author. Joe Fassler. This is from 2021. May. There's a whole series. He's got like a few different articles. But one of the things he points out in this particular article is the lack of consensus on what regenerative farming actually is. He says the lack of consensus is visible at the most basic level. In a new study published in Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems, scholars from the University of Colorado Boulder looked at how regenerative agriculture was defined across 229 academic journal articles and 25 practitioner websites. They found that only 51% of research articles that use the term supplied any sort of definition, while 85% of practitioner organizations did. Meanwhile, among the sources that did provide a definition, the details varied dramatically. Many, but far from all, of the sources surveyed said that regenerative was about improving soil health or sequestering carbon. For some, the term meant using no-till practices or planting cover crops. For others, it was about integrating livestock and crop production or improving animal welfare practices. For still others, it was about improving human health or food access or food safety. Some said it was about supporting small-scale systems. Others said it was about improving the social and economic well-being of communities, regardless of farm size. Some said it was about increasing yields. Some said it was about increasing profits. So the list goes on, and this particular article breaks it down even further by the percentage of articles that name these various things. But I know when I watched that documentary a couple of years ago, I just felt like it was no different than really what we term free range. I mean, at the end of the day, statistics are done on how much. Like if you figure the average American diet, you would need so many acres of land. Like I said, at that time, this was a couple of years ago, they were saying you need 3.5 Earths to sustain the average American diet for using regenerative farming, which in my view is just the same as free range. It's because if you just think about it, it's kind of what I was saying earlier about factory farming. In factory farming, all the animals are crowded together in this very tight space. In regenerative farming and or open range, or is it free range? Open range. It's more spread out. So there's more animals spread out over larger acres of land. And of course that creates more water usage, more land usage.
Clearing.
Yeah, land clearing. So
in addition to that, if I could interrupt you.
Yeah.
When you're not feeding them grain, when you're allowing them to forage and graze on grass, they grow so much slower and produce so much less body mass. So you're going to need more animals because they don't get fattened up.
Right.
And
which just costs way more.
So yeah, exactly. So the grain finishing, that's the industry term for basically fattening them up before you slaughter them. Again, it's so much more efficient at quickly getting meat to market, right? So yeah, like when they're not getting fed feed to fatten them up and they're having to find their own food, they stay lean.
Right.
You're going to end up needing a lot more animals, which means a lot more land.
Right.
Yeah, it's completely bonkers. It's so backwards in terms of thinking that this is going to solve any problems.
Right. It's actually worse for the environment. Yeah, a funny thing is this whole conversation where we talk about humane washing and greenwashing, I can't help but think, and I think in our next show after this is going to be about hunting and the whole concept of conservation, which is a funny word for maintaining wildlands for hunting. Does that make sense? Conservation is the word, and it's kind of like humane washing.
And greenwashing.
Yeah, and greenwashing. Yeah, we use the word conservation to maintain hunting grounds. It's a weird concept, and that just again makes you think about you're doing something wonderful when you're supporting these conservation organizations. But similarly, you know, as we said, Hope Bohanec, the author of the Humane Hoax, mentioned that she started to see a change roughly around, I don't know, 2008, 9, 10, using these humane words like free range, cage free, you know, even organic. Organic is a humane label. But I was just thinking, you know, long before that, you know, children's books, it just keeps coming back to me. We've mentioned this before, but like, you know, you open up a child's book about the farm, the animals, everything's beautiful, you know, it's lush, you know, the animals are happy, and, you know, you get to meet all the animals and they're smiling and just having a wonderful time playing in the farmyard. And it just occurred to me, somebody should write a book, a children's book, showing like the reality of.
I mean, those books are out there.
Are they?
Yeah, like books for vegan children.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, I gotta see one of those. I didn't know that. All right. Well, shoot.
Say the
No,
truth
but
to your kids.
like they're obviously they're not the mainstream, but yeah. As a preschool teacher, I see the books, the puzzles, all of it, all the curriculums that show the happy animals. And like you said, a child just believes this is where cool animals get to live.
Right.
It's completely forgotten that they are raised there and killed there,
Right.
and then replaced with new ones continually. That it's a place to fatten them up or exploit them for secretions and then
Right.
kill them. Yeah.
And it's worth repeating again. We mentioned this in the last episode, but whether you're on a feedlot, a factory farm, which is a bad word, or a wonderful, happy farm, a humane, free-range farm, the animals are killed the same. It takes the same equipment to kill them. So
And exploited the same.
exploited the
Modified.
same. Yeah. So it's, in fact, I think psychologically it's worse.
Enslaved.
They're enslaved. Yeah, in Oliver Sacks' book, The Anthropologist on Mars, one of his chapters is devoted to Temple Grandin and how she created this. It was kind of like a hugging machine that hugged the cows or hugged the animals right before they're about to be slaughtered. And to me, I mean, what a betrayal, right? You're trying to comfort them in their last moments, and then you slaughter them. I mean,
Unnecessarily, too.
unnecessarily. It's just crazy. We think that's okay. It's kind of diabolical. It's almost like a personality disorder. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like a schizophrenia is what it is. So anyway, and the fact that we think that's okay, the fact that we think that's okay, it's just crazy.
Because it makes us feel better.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this show is turning into just a little bit of a smorgasbord of just, you know, thoughts that this book prompted in us. Because one thing that keeps coming up for me is that a lot of people are so dismayed and horrified by the Brazilian rainforest being decimated. But what isn't made popular information is the reason why they're cutting down the rainforest. And the reason why they're cutting down the rainforest, the biggest reason, the biggest driver is for beef production and for grazing and for growing crops to feed livestock.
Right.
And this book points out that Brazil's basically just doing exactly the same thing that was done all over Europe just centuries ago.
Right.
And all over North America, the same exact thing. We basically, if you look at it from, the space level view down onto Earth, we basically mowed down our forests on continent-wide basis. We just mowed down our forests to create animal agriculture. And I also like to note that one thing that we don't talk about is this was a strategic move by colonists to take over not just the land and the resources, but the indigenous people. They came in and they set up. They literally would say, there's no animals, there's no livestock on this land. I guess it doesn't belong to anybody. So to establish ownership of land, they would put livestock on that land and say, now it's ours. So colonists used animal agriculture to colonize entire continents.
Wow.
And that's something that we should remember. This is not the natural state of the land. it was used strategically to take over, not just the land and the resources, but the people who live there.
Right.
And yeah, what Brazil is doing right now, they're just mirroring what we did to this continent, North America, and what Europe did to the European continent. And, this book also mentions that major U.S. companies, including Walmart, Costco, and Kroger, have been selling beef directly linked to Amazon deforestation. So just keep in mind, if the tearing down of the Amazonian rainforest is something that you don't want to support, just keep in mind that the meat that is being sold at Walmart, Costco, and Kroger is directly linked to Amazon deforestation.
Wow, that's crazy. And again, it just reminds you, right? A lot of people think they're getting their, here in Bozeman or in Montana, we're getting our meat directly from ranches here in Montana. But maybe that's true, and maybe you have to make arrangements on your own. But it seems like if you go into your typical grocery store around here, you're going to be getting meat from elsewhere, including the Amazon. And that just seems crazy if you think about it, like shipping animal parts from Brazil to here. It seems ridiculous. I mean, and again, we talk about greenwashing. It comes back to, if you care about the environment, think about, and you want to bitch about fossil fuels, then think about how many fossil fuels you're burning just so you can have your steak here in Bozeman, Montana, that's from Brazil.
Yeah, and transportation is only a small fraction of the environmental footprint of a product. It's like I believe it's like 10% or something. I'm not exactly sure, but it's like basically what you eat or what you buy is more important than how far it's traveled.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's very important to remember.
Yeah. The local food craze. That's probably not a fair word, but yeah, the local food concern has actually been proven to be very misguided. That what you eat is way more important in terms of its environmental impact than worrying about how far it had to travel. Because the traveling, like Lucy said so well, like the traveling portion of its carbon footprint is such a tiny percentage of the whole picture. So, eating plants, no matter where they come from, is friendlier to the earth than eating local meat.
Even non-organic plants are better for the environment than organic meat, etc., or like whatever label you would use. But of course, we're not saying that if you want to try eating more local, for example, if you're like plant-based or more organic, that's fine. Of course, that's better, especially organic. It's much better. But in terms of like what you actually can do as an impact, it's never gonna be as much as just completely cutting out animal foods or whatever products.
Right. But I think what this reminds me of too is the whole debate, right? I think we all hold to the view that animal agriculture is one of the biggest drivers of climate change. And yet you've got other people that disagree with that. They still think it's fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. Okay. And yet there seems to be more and more evidence to suggest that actually it's animal agriculture is the biggest driver. And if you just think about your beef here in Bozeman, Montana, coming from Brazil, and everything that's happening, cutting down rainforests, right? You have species extinction, all the carbon that's getting released, and the fact that you don't, methane, everything, the fact that you don't have the plants there to absorb more carbon, right? Because you're cutting them down. Okay. I mean, if you just put it all together, if you do the math and you add the fuel consumption, the fossil fuel consumption, animal agriculture, it seems pretty clearly that it is the biggest driver of climate change. So again, if you care about the environment, if you care about the climate, if you care about ecology, all those things, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, all that good stuff, you might want to consider your diet.
And it's also hard to get that information. This information is out there, but it's like there's so much lobbying from these industries to hide that fact.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a Guardian article by George Monbiot where he talks about, and he follows climate pretty closely, and he shows up at the UN conferences. And, he mentions for COP27, he was hoping there would be more talk at the UN summit on climate change about livestock farming. And here in just an article he wrote for The Guardian, he says an analysis of our world in data shows that even if greenhouse gas pollution from every other sector were eliminated today, by 2100, food production will, on its current trajectory, bust the global carbon budget 2 or 3 times over. This is largely because of animal farming, which accounts for 57% of greenhouse gases from the food system, though it provides just 18% of the calories. I mean, there you go. That is crazy. This issue has become even more urgent now. We know the heating impact of methane is rising. Livestock farming is the world's greatest source of methane released by human activities, yet there is no mention of it in the Global Methane Pledge launched at last year's Climate Summit. Again, this was an article titled "There's One Big Subject Our Leaders at COP27 Won't Touch: Livestock Farming," and that came from November 2022, a year ago. So
Right. So it uses more resources, more land, produces the fewest calories,
right,
and yet nobody wants to talk about it. And I mean, and we've experienced this even with NPR.
right.
If we could just go ahead and call them out.
Love to.
They love to talk about climate every day, and they talk about fossil fuels every day.
Right.
But it's like, why are you ignoring something that is an enormous cause of climate change?
No, it used to kill me.
They never mention animal agriculture.
No, hardly ever. And I mean, when they do, it's glossed over. I mean, I was an avid listener of NPR, and I would just get so frustrated with them. They would talk about water shortages, and they'd throw out the word climate change, climate change, climate change, climate change. You want to talk about talking points? Listen to NPR all day, as I used to. And no matter what show you listen to, you'd hear the same thing. And they would talk about, water shortages in the Colorado River Basin, for instance, the lower Colorado River Basin. Well, at the end of that are a bunch of factory farms. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So, they're getting people to not water their lawn a couple days a week. Well, how about don't eat the hamburger? One hamburger is 600 gallons of water.
Right.
Household
water usage is like 8% of our water usage, and the rest is animal agriculture.
No,
a lot of the rest is.
I mean, it's totally ridiculous, and all very interesting. So, yeah, that's good. I have to say, though, it's good to see journalists, non-NPR journalists, and I used to push back on NPR on Twitter, but it's good to see that people are taking livestock farming seriously.
So I mentioned a debate I was listening to earlier this week on veganism, and the person that eats animals quoted or referenced this farm in Georgia. It's called White Oak Pastures in Bluffton, Georgia. And I guess a few years ago, 2019, they had quite the media splash when they came out saying that their cows have basically a negative carbon footprint. That somehow that they were doing regenerative farming correctly, and that they had cracked the code on how to have environmentally friendly, a climate friendly beef farm. And the book points out, this I heard about it on the debate. It was thrown into the face of the vegan that animal agriculture can be done in a environmentally friendly way. And then I came home and I was reading the Humane Hoax, one of the chapters on greenwashing, and they reference this farm. And they say, first of all, the research, White Oak Pastures paid to be researched by this company called Qantas. And Qantas is also, they provided research. They were employed by Nestle and they came out saying that bottled water is environmentally friendly. So, right away, the research company is discredited, that basically whoever is paying them, they will come up with the results desired. So, but Qantas basically did come out with this big study saying that White Oak Pastures has a negative carbon footprint. They basically, on the website, it says like White Oak Pastures is storing more carbon in its soil than its pasture-raised cows emit during their lifetime. Shop now. Carbon negative beef. So the book goes through that this is blatant greenwashing, that the Qantas report on white oak pastures has since been peer-reviewed, and that actually white oak pastures uses 2.5 times more land and is not carbon neutral at all. Basically, I'll read a little bit of this. It says, this is despite their attempt to build carbon in the soil by bringing in feed not grown on their farm and cycling it through animals, cherry-picking estimates on the land to favor results that could show grazing methods were the reason for land sequestration, inputting compost, using cover crops. Basically, it just goes through that all of their data points and shows that it's very dishonest, and that white oak pastures is in fact not carbon neutral at all. So once again, it's like, these claims are made, and people don't really follow up to find out, like, what exactly are you saying, and what exactly are you including in your data, and what are you leaving out of your data?
Right.
And then it makes a big media splash where it helps people feel better about that they really don't have to make any changes. And it's only later that things get peer reviewed and proven that actually that was all garbage research.
Right. Well, yeah, unfortunately, marketing has made its way into research, and now it's about the bottom line, making money, and we have to help the consumer feel like everything's okay. Everything's okay. Your food choices are okay.
So we want to recap briefly what we talked about, like the different impacts animal agriculture has on the environment and climate change. So the water use, the land use, meaning land clearing for pastures, and the land used for growing the crops we feed to animals. The machinery used in the process, the methane gas, and the animal waste pollution as well. And of course, the dead zones that come with animal agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
In the oceans, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is the conclusion to one of the chapters on greenwashing from the Humane Hoax. At this stage of the environmental crisis, we're past the point of having the luxury of small incremental changes. Rewilding and sustainable plant-based production systems are clear solutions that address many root problems. There are cultural and social barriers to change, but there's no sense in preserving traditions that result in countless ethical atrocities and an uninhabitable planet. We need a movement that values coexistence with nature and respect for land and the wildlife on it. To spark a movement to rewild the world and address both the climate and biodiversity crises, we must shift away from animal agriculture and transition to global plant-based food system. Also in this chapter, he names several organizations, and I'm sure there's just going to be more and more of these, I hope and pray, that are set up to specifically help animal agriculture farmers transition into plant agriculture. And he even had a quote in there from one of those farmers who just said, this is just about doing the right thing and changing with the times. And, basically animal agriculture is outdated, and it's served its purpose, and we should move on from it, because it's just hurting the planet.
Yeah. And we didn't mention that too much, but we had them in mind. We're also talking about fisheries and wild-caught fish here. So obviously there's no like environmentally friendly way to catch a fish, even in the wild. This is, we might have to do an episode on that in the future, but it was included in our thought process.
No, 100%. Yeah, and I was watching a video of her where she was talking about that, how even in these fisheries, they're almost like factory farms. They're overcrowded, and these fish get lice, and they're diseased, and it's just everything you would find in a factory farm on land with all the disease, and they have to use antibiotics to kill because of all the overcrowding. The same thing's happening in these fish farms.
And yeah, the commercial fishing in the ocean is overfishing the ocean to the point where the ecosystems are starting to collapse, and they're starting to be very concerned about the health of our oceans.
Let's
Totally.
rewild our oceans as well.
There we go.
Leave them alone.
Leave them alone.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, thanks for listening.
Yes.
This,
Thank you.
and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.